In establishing the thematic strand for its annual writing project, the Scottish Book Trust website informs us this year that storytelling is inherent to Scotland's national identity. The stories we tell and who we share them with are a fundamental part of our lives. To the seasoned ASLS Schools Conference veteran and class teacher of English, many of Scotland's stories and storytellers are well kent, beloved, and our copies of favourite books well thumbed or heavily annotated. But the text that forms the basis of this present paper, Hannah Lavery's Lament for Sheku Bayoh, is noteworthy precisely for the fact that it begs us to confront the stories we actively choose not to tell, the stories that are not palatable, and the stories that asked us to consider who we really are as a nation. The play is, as Hannah Lavery describes, a provocation of a text, and it is, I would argue, one of the most noteworthy literary texts to emerge from Scotland in the last decade for the unambiguous way in which it challenges our national collective conscience and the country's cultural consciousness. In the opening monologue for Lament for Sheku Bayoh, the second speaker rhetorically probes, do we have to be on the right side of every story we tell ourselves? And in doing so, opens the dramatic space up to an interrogation of this notion. The play forces us, whether we're ready or not, to consider the ways in which our nation might have whitewashed and might still be whitewashing narratives that showcase Scotland as a welcoming country and tolerant nation. Scotland, You'll Know Mine, is a particularly arresting introduction to the thematic impulses, identity, race and belonging inherent in the writer's work to date. A snippet has been excerpted for you on the handout. Scotland, you'll know mine, you will know his, and I don't want you. So go ahead, say I don't belong, with your sepia-tinged cross-eye sweeping over all that swept-away, blood-stained, sweat-stained sugar for your tablet, your macaroon, your rotten, gobby, greedy, thieving be you. It's observationally brilliant and confrontational. Scotland, You'll Know Mine is a rabble-rousing work that commands the reader's attention, and it's exactly the right type of poem for capturing the attention of a rabble-rowdy S3 class. I've got 3 of them this year. Moreover, it's a perfect companion piece to the play that we're going to hold up for further consideration today. Lament for Sheku Bayoh was initially staged in 2019 at the Edinburgh International Festival. At the time, the play was a work in progress that sat within the festival's You Are Here programme of interrogative creative responses to contemporary social, political and environmental issues. The play is rooted in real tragedy, foregrounding for scrutiny the death of 31-year-old Sheku Bayoh while in police custody following his arrest in Kirkcaldy, Fife in 2015. Contextual details are vital to know before reading this play, and so the reported details of Bayoh's death, according to the Guardian newspaper, are these. Bayoh died after police officers responded to reports of a black man in an agitated state carrying a knife on the 3rd of May 2015. He was hit with batons, CS spray and pepper spray, then restrained on the pavement with wrist and leg ties. A toxicology report confirmed that Bayoh had taken some drugs that night, but no bladed weapon was found. An independent inquiry into Bayoh's death, currently underway in Edinburgh and overseen by Lord Brackadale, is the results of years of campaigning by his family, who argue that his untimely death was caused by positional asphyxia. He was, they argue, suffocated by the tactics employed by the intending police. The family alleged that officers overreacted in their use of physical restraints and that this overreaction was ultimately motivated to some degree by racial bias. These witnesses assert that they did not see proof of a physical attack on a female officer by Sheku Bayoh before he died. And again, it must be stressed that the inquiry is ongoing and no definitive conclusions have yet been reached. But if the reported details of this case sound horrifyingly familiar, though the name of Sheku Bayoh perhaps does not, it might be because we, on hearing reports of alleged police brutality towards young black men, are immediately transported across the Atlantic to America and those infamously high-profile deaths, such as that of George Floyd in 2020. While Floyd's death sparked a moment of international outrage and activism, Bayoh's death, by comparison, feels overlooked, ignored. Why? This play thinks it knows. Lament for Sheku Bayoh probes the here and the now, Scotland in the 21st century, to uncover buried truths about racism in the country. In her frank foreword to the printed edition of the play, Lavery states her position clearly, quote, "We're not the country we promote to others, and more importantly to ourselves. People in Scotland who experience racism have to spend so much time getting people to admit racism actually exists." This is the loose societal thread that Lavery proceeds to tease at and fray during the course of her play. The tragic death of a man in questionable circumstances then is, for most learners within upper broad general education, an accessible narrative to understand. There are many ways to use this text in the classroom, beyond a traditional lit study. Nonetheless, if traditional literary study is what you're after, then this text offers layers of formal and structural complexity that will afford teachers scope to extend challenge and promote literary critical rigour in those preparing for National 5 and higher. The first point of interest for learners in this respect is that the play is a piece of documentary or investigative theatre, one that curates pre-existing source materials, such as newspaper articles, government reports and interviews, into a dramatic whole to interrogate or challenge a contemporary issue. Lavery's curatorial practice is crucial. As she notes in her foreword, quote, "I wanted to write a lament informed by what I could discover with no special access, what anyone could find out if they chose to." That final qualification is for me a particularly loaded one, with the implication being that very few are seeking answers or information in cases such as Sheku's. Helpfully, source materials are either referenced or included at the end of the 2021 Salamander Street printed edition of the play, and pupils should be encouraged to undertake factual research as an integral part of the pre-reading process. An interesting exercise introducing pupils to the form of documentary theatre might be to ask them to identify a contemporary news story unfolding across multiple platforms in real time and to stitch together articles from various news sources as well as social commentary from Twitter into an enriched retelling of that story. In class, having established the parameters of investigative theatre, learners might then be invited to consider the play's structure. Rather than acts and scenes, we find a more fragmented and episodic structural arrangement. Categorising the fragments, we find a lament in 10 parts, 3 vignettes labelled as conversations, 3 short pauses, a section called the photograph, and one called 30 seconds, part 1 and 2. This structure reflects, I think, the literary stitching together of disclosure, interviews and reporting, but it also means that the audience are never allowed to forget that this is real life interrogated by art. In the second instance, to lament in its verb form means to complain. There are many complaints levelled in this play, largely to do with the approaches adopted by the police to restrain Bayoh in the minutes leading up to his death. Another significant complaint is about the failure of Police Scotland to bring criminal charges against those culpable for the death. The playwright also raises a complaint about the nation's continued inability to have an honest conversation about race and racial tensions in contemporary Scotland. To encourage pupils to further consider how Lavery makes effective use of lament in this play, I've suggested a range of activities in the teaching note that should be or has been available after the talk. These activities include a reading of Robert Burns' A Fond Kiss, and that is a poem that actually appears midway through the play. Time today does not permit a more thorough close reading of the text, so to capture the essence of this play and catalyse your own thinking on it, I wanted to foreground 4 extracts of the play for your consideration. Those being the Lament Part 1, pages 9 and 10, First Pause, pages 11 and 12, Lament Part 4 into the second pause, and Conversation 3. So to the Lament Part 1. In its challenging and interrogative approach to Scottish cultural myth-making, in addition to the way that an austere cast of actors transition into multiple characters or plays, Lavery's Lament for Sheku Bayoh feels, to me at least, like a necessary 21st century update of a now canonical Scottish drama text, Liz Lockhead's Mary Queen of Scots got her head chopped off. This assertion is nowhere better exemplified than in a comparative reading of the two plays' openings. In Mary Queen of Scots, the tricksy choric figure of Corby, or the Crow, outlines the contradictory nature of Scotland in a monologue called Scotland What Like. Amongst other things, Scotland is either, quote, a tenement or a merchant's hall, it's a house or a humble cot, Prince's Street or Paddy's Market. It depends. It depends. I didn't ken what like your Scotland is. Here's mine. Lavery's Lament for Sheku Bayoh seems to pick up the dramatic baton, so to speak, with the voice of the second keener, whose role in the monologue is to probe established beliefs about contemporary Scotland. As though continuing from Corby's prompt, here's mine, the second keener says, we walk our preserved battlefields, laying stone and towering cairns, kilted and tearful in Scottish schools' assemblies. We sing of our beautiful defeats, our fallen, ignoring anything, anyone who may dispute the telling. Do we have to be on the right side of every story we tell ourselves? Is that belonging? What would it cost us to lift him broken from a Kirkcaldy street to cradle him as our own? Can we still say we love this place if we don't? Can we still sell this vision of ourselves to ourselves? Both playwrights use their opening platform to query the oft-peddled myth that there is, quote, no problem here, pal. Where Lockhead focuses on wealth-based inequality, Lavery focuses on race-based inequality and injustice. A comparative reading such as this could be a valuable exercise for learners to undertake if you only envisage using literary text as launchpads into discursive writing or talking. Ask learners to consider what injustices are apparent to them in Scotland in the 2020s and to present their findings in a dramatic monologue, a broadly discursive essay or a presentation. As an introduction to the drama text, the Lament for Sheku Bayoh, and as part one of a 10-part lament, this section of the play is tonally unusual. If a lament is an outpouring of grief, a memorial to the dead, we must wonder what Lavery is lamenting in this section. Broadly and generally, I think, the second keener laments the absence of critical discourse, the societal failure to confront home truths, the distinct absence of genuine introspection over race in Scotland. Specifically and locally, though, the opening quietly laments society's abject failing of one man who died an untimely and preventable death for which we failed to be outraged. Though it appears early in the play, this idea is arguably the abiding impression that the reader is forced to take away from the play. Sadly, the audience are never allowed to reach a more hopeful conclusion than this. Only weeks ago, this sobering idea of the abject futility of trying to hold institutions to account on the grounds of racism was given further credence. On September the 5th, 2022, an unarmed black man, Chris Cabba, was shot dead by a police officer in Streatham Hill, South London. And as Cabba's grieving family came to terms with their tragic loss, they felt urgent accountability was needed on the part of the police as they called for the immediate suspension of the firearms officer involved. An outpouring of public outrage in relation to the police involvement and subsequent handling of the suspension followed. And as the family await further updates from the Independent Office for Police Conduct, the Met Police Federation's chair, Ken Marsh, gave a statement in which he said that while the Federation had, quote, no issue with the investigation, they believed the suspension was, quote, based purely on public perception. So into conversation 3. Tonally, this dialogue between the first and second keeners feels like a conversation overheard in a pub. Those conversations that can turn very quickly in a pinhead from topical musing to heated debate. The first keener tables a motion. What if the police are the danger? It's a question that provokes outrage in the second. We are not America and Scotland is not racist. The second keener responds, but the first keener, a person of colour, urges second keener to think more on the idea. I'll lay it out for you, pal, but you should know it's not my job to be your teacher. Newspaper reports and university research are offered in this conversation by way of concrete evidence that Scotland does have a problem with race, and the second keener's conviction begins to falter. I don't know what The second keener wants to know what they ought to do differently. Start by listening. Start by saying we have a problem. Start, the first keener, urges by understanding and accepting. This section concludes on a profound note with the voice of the first keener. And us, what is us? Scottish, what is that to you? Interchangeable with white? I am us too. Don't you say I'm Scottish too? I am Scotland too. If you're confident enough, you might take these closing questions and use them as a basis for a group discussion. Working collaboratively with colleagues in modern studies, history, geography and RE to produce resources in contemporary demographics, migration, race, ethnicity and religion might offer a rewarding ideal opportunity. Finally, the National Theatre of Scotland's website offers teachers supporting resources, including interviews and videos through its education portal. Opened by foregrounding what I saw as a central question of Hannah Lavery's Lament for Sheku Bayoh. Do we have to be on the right side of every story we tell ourselves? Perhaps reframing it for today's schools conference, the question might instead be, are we even telling ourselves the stories in the first place? Our learners ought to be exposed to a multitude of experiences and voices, as well as a diversity of texts, and then given the critical tools by which to make informed decisions on which side of each story they are going to fall. I cannot recommend this text enough as a third, fourth level text that speaks directly to the learners in front of us and to the global society that they inhabit. In closing this paper, I want to return to the Scottish Book Trust website for the Year of the Story, where we find a powerful reminder of the prevailing importance of story and testimony. Quote, "From remembering the tales passed down to us from family, the defining moments that shaped our lives, or the places, people and communities that helped us find home, stories connect us to ourselves and the people around us. Let's ensure then, as we are moving into our next iteration of CFE, that we're choosing and using texts that allow our learners to connect with, communicate truthfully about and uncover the real essence of the place that they call home."